Peter Griffin is in a mental institution. Peter Griffin is not a lovable idiot living a chaotic suburban life. He is a broken man confined to a psychiatric facility, and Family Guy is the elaborate fantasy he constructed inside his own shattered mind to survive a loss so catastrophic it destroyed him completely. The real story, pieced together by fans who tracked the show's internal logic across 20 years of episodes, starts on a single night when everything Peter Griffin loved ceased to exist. His daughter Meg, in reality a beautiful and popular teenager, drove his son Chris home from a party while drunk. Chris, who suffered oxygen deprivation at birth and lived with a real intellectual disability, died in the crash alongside Meg. Lois, already pregnant with Stewie, could not survive the grief. She took her own life before the baby was born. Peter, left with nothing, broke completely. What followed was not recovery. It was the construction of an entirely alternative reality, built inside a mind that chose fantasy over the unbearable truth. In that fantasy, Meg is alive but punished constantly, absorbing the resentment of a father who cannot consciously admit she killed his son. Chris is lovable rather than disabled because the truth of who Chris actually was is too painful to hold. Stewie exists as the son Peter never met, reimagined as a genius, because that's what infinite, unrealized potential looks like inside a grieving father's imagination. And Quahog is not a town, it's a ward, and nobody is coming to save Peter from it. Lois was never who she claimed. The Lois Griffin the show presents is warm, patient, occasionally exasperated, and fundamentally decent underneath her flaws. But the theory that reframes her entire characterization says Lois has been hiding a version of herself that surfaces consistently across 20 years of episodes, and the show has been treating the evidence as character inconsistency rather than the deliberate portrait it might actually be. Lois was raised by Carter Pewterschmidt, one of the wealthiest and most morally flexible men in Quahog, a man whose parenting style the show consistently depicts as transactional, controlling, and deeply conditional. She rejected that life when she chose Peter, a choice the show presents as romantic, but the theory reframes as rebellion without a destination. She had no real plan beyond escaping her father's expectations, and when the reality of life with Peter arrived, the cracks started appearing. She has cheated, repeatedly, across the show's run, with Brian, with Quagmire, referenced affairs with Bill Clinton. The show plays these as jokes the audience moves past quickly. But the theory says they form a pattern, not of a flawed wife, occasionally making mistakes, but of a woman who chose the wrong life and has been quietly trying to escape it ever since, without ever quite having the courage to leave completely. Her nagging, her volatility, her increasingly controlling behavior in later seasons maps onto someone who made a permanent decision at 20 and has been paying for it every day since. Brian's intelligence has a dark origin. Brian Griffin is the most unusual dog in the history of television. He drives. He drinks martinis. He writes novels, votes in elections, holds political opinions, dates human women, and engages in philosophical debates that no biological canine brain could produce, regardless of how the show handles it comedically. The show has never offered a satisfying explanation for why Brian is this way, framing his intelligence as simply a given, a premise the audience accepts, because the alternative requires asking a question the writers apparently didn't want to answer directly. The theory answers it by connecting two confirmed pieces of the show's own expanded universe canon. In American Dad, created by the same team and confirmed to exist in the same universe as Family Guy through multiple acknowledged crossovers, Klaus the Goldfish is explicitly established to be a German Olympic ski jumper whose brain was surgically extracted and implanted into a fish's body by the CIA as part of a classified experimentation program. This is not speculation. It's confirmed, stated directly on screen, as canon within the universe both shows share. If one CIA brain transplant victim exists in this universe, walking around fully aware inside an animal's body, the logical extension is that Brian is another. The theory says Brian isn't a unique miracle of canine evolution. He was a man. Someone extracted his brain, placed it inside a dog, and then apparently arranged for him to be taken in by the one family in Quahog least likely to notice or investigate anything unusual about their talking, drinking, philosophy-reading pet. Stewie de-aged the entire family. Stewie Griffin begins the series as a genuine, calculating threat. He builds weapons. He plots matricide with the same operational seriousness a military planner brings to an actual campaign. He has access to technology centuries ahead of anything existing in Quahog. And then, across the show's run, something changes. The weapons disappear. The plots to kill Lois fade. The supervillain architecture of the character collapses into something softer, more childlike, more interested in emotional connection than world domination. The show presents this as gradual character development. The theory says something else happened entirely. Stewie, as established across multiple episodes, possesses the technical capability to manipulate age at a biological level. He has de-aged himself within the show's own confirmed events. The theory argues he used this same technology on his family and on himself deliberately. His motivation was Brian. Stewie looked forward in time, saw Brian growing old, saw the inevitable gap between a dog's lifespan and a genius baby's extended existence, and made the only decision available to someone who cannot tolerate loss. He rebuilt everyone around him as younger versions of themselves, buying more time with the only person in the family who actually sees him fully. The shift in Stewie's character across the series isn't growth. It's the cost of the procedure. Something in the de-aging process took the edges off Stewie too. He got Brian. He lost the version of himself that didn't need anyone. Meg is Stewie's biological mother. In the banned episode Partial Terms of Endearment, Lois states directly, in dialogue, that Meg gave birth to Stewie. The show drops the line into a rapid-fire comedic exchange and moves past it immediately, the way it handles hundreds of similarly dark throwaway gags across its run. But what the show doesn't do, and what the theory considers the most significant detail in the entire exchange, is generate a reaction from Meg. Meg Griffin, a character who spends the entirety of her existence in Quahog reacting with visible, sustained anguish to every slight directed at her, says absolutely nothing in response to being told on screen that she is secretly the biological mother of her own younger sibling. No correction, no protest, no expression of any kind. The theory says that silence is a confession, the show embedded inside a joke, specifically because jokes are deniable afterward. If Meg became pregnant as a teenager, and the family absorbed the child into the household as Lois's own, rather than face the social reality of a teenage daughter's pregnancy, then the relentless cruelty Meg receives from every member of her family across 20 years of episodes carries a completely different weight. It isn't random, it's resentment. The kind that builds in families around secrets everyone knows and nobody will name. Stewie's occasional moments of genuine tenderness toward Meg, rarer than his tenderness toward anyone else but present when the show allows them, become something else entirely in this reading. The theory says he knows. On some level, in the way a child knows things without having the language to name them, Stewie has always known. Quagmire knows everything about everyone. Glenn Quagmire is presented throughout the series as a sex-obsessed neighbor whose entire characterization rests on his relentless, legally questionable pursuit of women and his inexhaustible supply of self-confidence about it. The show uses him as comedy, as contrast, and occasionally as the character who delivers the most devastatingly accurate assessments of the people around him. That last function is where the theory begins. Quagmire knows things, specific things, personal things. He delivers observations about Peter, about Brian, about the entire Griffin family dynamic with a precision that consistently exceeds what casual neighborly contact should produce. The theory argues this is because Quagmire's career, confirmed across the show as a commercial airline pilot requiring extensive background clearance and significant government interaction, has given him both the means and the training to gather information on the people around him in ways nobody in Quahog has ever suspected or examined. His house is directly across the street from the Griffins. His lifestyle gives him a cover for irregular hours and unexplained absences. His social persona, the loudly self-promoting womanizer who nobody takes seriously enough to watch carefully, is the most effective intelligence cover imaginable. The theory says Quagmire has files, not metaphorical files, actual documentation, on Peter, on Lois, on Brian specifically, whose personal failings Quagmire catalogs with a specificity in the famous takedown speech that goes well beyond what someone observes casually from across a cul-de-sac. The show died with the cancellation. Family Guy was canceled in 2002. It returned in 2005, after extraordinary DVD sales and Adult Swim ratings demonstrated a surviving audience. And from the moment it returned, something was different. The characters shifted in ways the production team never fully explained, and that go considerably beyond simple creative evolution across a hiatus. Pre-cancellation, Meg is treated with genuine parental love in multiple episodes, a warmth that vanishes so completely after the return that the show itself eventually lampshades it by having the family openly acknowledge their contempt for her existence. Pre-cancellation Stewie is a committed villain. Post-cancellation Stewie becomes progressively softer, more interested in emotional connection, eventually abandoning the matricide plots that defined his entire early characterization. Pre-cancellation, Brian is grounded, thoughtful, and functioning as the show's voice of reason. Post-cancellation, Brian becomes increasingly insufferable, ideologically rigid, and prone to exactly the pretentious, self-defeating behavior he once existed in the show to gently satirize. The theory says, these aren't the same characters in the same universe. When Stewie and Brian travel back to the pilot episode in Back to the Pilot, the Redditor who built this theory argues they don't travel back in time, they travel sideways. Into the original universe, the one that got canceled, the one where Meg was loved, and Stewie was dangerous, and Brian was wise. The show that came back was a parallel version, wearing the same faces, living in the same house, but never quite the same family that earned the audience that saved it. Peter's dead brother controls everything. Peter references a dead older brother in a single episode, a throwaway line delivered with the specific casual cruelty Peter uses most effectively when he's actually touching something real underneath the performance. He tells Chris that his older brother, who died, was better than Chris at sports and at talking, a comparison so precisely designed to wound that it stops landing as a joke the longer you sit with it. The theory takes this single line and constructs an entire hidden architecture around it. The dead brother, never named, never described beyond those two attributes, is the theory's explanation for why Peter relates to his own son Chris the way he does. Peter never stops comparing Chris to someone Chris never knew existed and can never compete with. The casual dismissal, the low expectations, the way Peter interacts with Chris as though he's perpetually disappointing a standard nobody told him about, all of it maps onto a man who grew up in the shadow of a brother he lost and never processed losing. The theory extends further. Peter's own self-destructiveness, his consistent behavior as someone who doesn't believe he deserves to keep the good things in his life, tracks with a man who survived when a sibling didn't. The survivor guilt, the show never names, sits underneath every reckless decision, every burned-down house, every friendship Peter damages and then inexplicably recovers. He is a man who has always believed, somewhere too deep to say out loud, that he was never supposed to be the one who made it. Cleveland Jr. is Peter's son. Cleveland Brown Jr. appears on The Cleveland Show as Cleveland's son from his first marriage. By the time of the spin-off, he's overweight, gentle, and noticeably different in temperament and appearance from the energetic, slim child briefly glimpsed in Family Guy's earlier seasons. The theory begins with something the show itself confirmed as canon. Loretta, Cleveland's ex-wife, had an affair with Quagmire, a storyline that destroyed the friendship and was played out across one of the show's most emotionally weighted episodes. The theory asks why the affair with Quagmire was considered noteworthy enough to become a significant plot point if it was the only affair Loretta was conducting. Cleveland Jr.'s appearance in the spin-off, specifically the roundness of his face, the shape of his features, and certain behavioral patterns, prompted fans to look more carefully at who else in the Griffin-Brown-Quagmire social circle Loretta might have had access to. Peter's own joke episode, in which he fantasizes about a show called My Black Son, becomes something considerably darker if the fantasy is actually closer to reality than Peter is consciously able to admit. The theory says Cleveland Jr. changed in the spin-off not because of lazy writing or a deliberate creative decision, but because the character's actual parentage was always going to emerge eventually in his physical and behavioral presentation. Cleveland raised a child who might have belonged to his best friend, and neither man has ever said a word about it. The cutaway gags are Peter's hallucinations. Family Guy's signature comedic device, the cutaway gag, is universally understood as a meta-narrative tool, the show breaking its own internal logic to insert a joke that exists outside the episode's actual storyline. Every fan of the show accepts this as simply how the format works. The theory refuses that acceptance. It argues the cutaway gags are not the show breaking its own rules. They are Peter Griffin experiencing dissociative episodes in real time. A man who spent years constructing an elaborate fantasy reality to survive catastrophic loss does not maintain a clean, stable, internally consistent inner world. The edges fray. Random associations surface without warning. The brain that built Quahog from grief and trauma also generates interruptions that come from somewhere else entirely. Memories that don't belong in the present scene. Fantasies within fantasies. Moments where the constructed reality collapses briefly into something else before reasserting itself. Every time the screen cuts away from the Griffin house to an unrelated sketch, the theory says that's Peter's mind jumping tracks. The longer the show runs, the more frequent and disconnected the cutaways become, because Peter's grip on the constructed reality he's been maintaining for 20 years is slowly, progressively, imperceptibly loosening. The show's comedic engine is its protagonist's deteriorating mental state, repackaged as an editing choice and presented to an audience that has been laughing at a breakdown for 2 decades without ever being told what they were actually watching. Stewie can see the future. Stewie Griffin has demonstrated, across multiple episodes, a relationship with time that goes beyond the time machine he builds in later seasons. He references future events before they occur. He reacts to situations with knowledge he shouldn't yet have. He occasionally looks directly at the camera with an expression that reads less like a baby breaking the fourth wall and more like a man watching a recording of something he's already lived through. The theory built around this says Stewie's time machine was not an invention. It was a recovery. Stewie arrived in the Griffin household already knowing how this story goes because he has already lived through it, possibly multiple times. In universes, the show's own multiverse episodes confirm exist in functional parallel to the one the audience watches. His early obsession with killing Lois isn't villainy, it's intervention. In the version of events Stewie remembers from a timeline the show never depicts, Lois does something, or something happens to Lois, that Stewie spent years trying to prevent before eventually concluding that prevention was impossible and abandoning the effort. The softening of Stewie across the show's run is not character growth. It's a man who has already tried every available option and arrived finally at the only position that remains: acceptance. The genius baby plotting world domination was always at the deepest level of what the theory proposes. A time traveler who came home and decided that this time he would simply try to enjoy what was left. Family Guy is a show within a show. Family Guy confirmed its own fictional status within its shared universe across 2 separate, distinct episodes that the fanbase has largely treated as jokes rather than the canonical bombshells they actually represent. In Season 15's Inside Family Guy, the audience receives a behind-the-scenes look at the production of Family Guy as a television show, complete with actors, crew, and a production infrastructure surrounding the Griffin family as performed characters rather than real people. In American Dad, Stan Smith lists his favorite fictional dogs, and Brian Griffin is on the list, establishing that in American Dad's universe, Brian is a fictional character from a television show rather than a real being existing in the same shared world. The theory says these 2 pieces of evidence are not throwaway meta-jokes. They are the show accidentally confirming what it could never say directly. Family Guy is a television show being watched by characters inside a larger universe. The Griffin family's inability to suffer permanent consequences, the way death gets reversed, and trauma gets forgotten, and catastrophic events reset between episodes, isn't a cartoon logic convenience. It's the accurate behavior of fictional characters inside a narrative that resets because narratives reset. Someone in the world of American Dad watches the Griffins every week the same way the audience does. And the Griffins, who have no idea they're being watched, keep living the same impossible, consequence-free life over and over. Because that's what television characters do when the episode ends and someone hits play again. The real Peter was smarter than anyone knew. Peter Griffin's stupidity is the show's foundational premise. Everything else, every joke, every catastrophe, every impossible situation the family navigates and survives, radiates outward from the established fact that Peter is a man of strikingly limited intelligence, operating in a world that occasionally and inexplicably accommodates him anyway. But the theory built around his real-world counterpart, The Peter Griffin who exists in the coma theory's version of events before the accident destroyed him describes a different man entirely. In the fantasy Peter constructs, his own intelligence is channeled almost entirely into Brian, the dog who reads, who debates, who understands nuance and articulates complex emotional truth, is Peter's own mind describing itself in the only safe container available. The character of Peter, stupid and impulsive and consequence-free, is what guilt looks like when it performs self-punishment. A man who believes he failed to protect his family doesn't get to be intelligent in the story he tells about himself afterward. He doesn't deserve competence. He doesn't deserve to be right. He builds a version of himself that stumbles through every situation and survives anyway, not because he earned it, but because the alternative, building a Peter who was smart and still couldn't save them, is the one version of this story he absolutely cannot write. Subscribe, because there are more of these, and the next one might change how you watch this show entirely.